Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the Connect and Learn about our workforce development sector. For those who I haven't met yet, I'm Sky Cornell. I'm SVP's Director of Consulting. And if I can just ask a favor, okay, great. I wanted to get everyone back on screen. Today, I'm just going to give a short introduction and we'll get right into it. But today we're going to be talking about SVP's investments and funding strategies. And this is a great group because I can see we're pretty mixed between people who are really deeply involved earlier this year and have been involved in prior years, and some people who might be hearing some of this information for the first time. So that's a really nice way to do learning between our SVP partnership. The key things we'll focus on is how the investment and funding strategies evolved in 2021 to really align with our strategic plan, which means for the first time, we really focused on key sectors, as well as really centering race equity really throughout the process. And out of that process, we now have 17 SVP projects. So we had quite a bit of evolution and growth coming out of this process, and new people are happy to say involved in many of the projects. And over a series of Connect and Learns in the coming months, we'll really talk about those projects and the sectors in more depth. Today, we're going to focus on the workforce development sector, as well as an overview of the process itself. And before we get into that, I have to say a huge and sincere thank you to Martha Mincer. These Connect and Learns would not be possible without her digging in and offering to help and communicate and coordinate and just ask really smart, thoughtful questions. So thank you, Martha. It's been great to work with you on these. And as well, I want to thank all of the committee members. Committee members played a huge role, really dug into this effort. And of course, yeah, big role, as Martha was saying. Of course, I want to thank Lisa Haas and Amy Ornstein, who co-led the effort. We'll turn it over to Lisa in just a minute, but really they co-led one of the biggest evolutions of our funding and investment strategies, and we're so grateful for their leadership and thoughtfulness. So let me turn it over to Lisa to speak in more depth. Lisa, quick intro. Lisa's been an SVP partner for a few years now. She directs community investments at the Community Fund of Darien. Prior to that, served on the board of the Community Fund, and she also plays a key leadership role as a grant chair at Impact Fairfield County. So we are incredibly lucky to have her leadership here, and thank you, Lisa. With that, I'll turn it over to you to talk about this process.
Great. Thanks, Sky, and thanks everyone for joining today. I am going to share my screen and pull up a few slides. Let's get this in presentation mode. I guess that's fine. Okay, so as Sky said, I was one of the co-chairs of the investment process this past year with Amy Ornstein, and we were tasked with kind of redeveloping the investment process. And I wanted to share some of those changes with you, but also update you on our current portfolio. So as Sky said, we aim to have our investments align with the new strategic framework that SVP adopted last year. And specifically, we wanted to focus on two sectors, education and career pathways, which we have largely called workforce development, and early childhood education. But we also really wanted to promote race equity and systems change work as well. So before we can really delve into kind of the new process, we wanted to talk about how it evolved from the process in prior years. In the past, organizations were largely nominated by SVP partners or staff, and they weren't really, didn't have a sort of a sector or a geographic focus. They really covered kind of cradle to career. And when the organizations were recommended, then those organizations submitted an application, which was then evaluated by the investment committee. So this year, we placed all the investment committee members onto sector teams. We had a workforce development team, early childhood education team, and then an emerging opportunities team. And these sector teams did a lot of preliminary research to kind of learn about their space and identify the needs and the players. And ultimately, they did the identification and a lot of the decision making. And I would characterize this as a much more bottoms up approach in selecting the organizations. The sector teams, after they did sort of preliminary phone calls, then submitted nomination forms, which were reviewed by the investment committee. Another big push this year was this idea of mutual assessment. We felt it was important to give the opportunity for all the organizations we were talking with an opportunity to really assess us and the role that SVP would be playing. So it made for a much more collaborative process. Another big change is that in the past, organizations were first evaluated, and then really the project was discussed. And based on feedback we had gotten, we really wanted to move this discussion of the project and the SVP resources right to the beginning of the process. And the last major change this year was that we felt it was necessary to consider new potential investments alongside reinvestments at the same time. So all the organizations in the current portfolio were asked to submit a reinvestment application, and both the new investments and the reinvestments were evaluated at the same time using the same criteria. So I think even more so than the changes in the process, I think the real changes this year really took place with kind of a change in mindset, as there was a big focus on relationship building and equity. All of the investment committee members participated in a training in active listening and recognizing bias. I think the SVP staff did a great job of identifying investment committee members that came from diverse experiences. A lot had real community-based knowledge in their cities, and they brought a wide range of perspectives. I also think while we did, develop new criteria, there was sort of a recognition that not all of the candidates would meet all of the criteria. And I think there was a greater willingness to meet the nonprofits kind of where they were. And ultimately, this led to a broader group of investments that really kind of were at various stages in their development. I think there was a greater focus on this mutual fit and partnership. And one of the ways this came out is that there was less kind of having organizations do a lot of work and then not being sort of approved to the next stage of the process. And lastly, there was a big emphasis on kind of balancing the power role between a funder and grantee. And a lot more emphasis was based on relationships and collaboration, which ultimately should help the project teams with their work. Here is the investment criteria we used this year. As we previously talked about, there was the sector focus on education and career pathways, early childhood education and emerging opportunities, and also race equity and system change. The other criteria was sort of assessing the capacity of each organization's readiness and need to take on an SVP team, SVP fit, organizational leadership strength, financial stability, and whether that the organization represented geographic expansion for SVP. This slide really talks about different stages in the process. as I mentioned, initially the investment teams were formed and participated in a training. And then the investment committee reviewed the nominations that were put forth by the sector team. Then all the organizations that had been approved by the investment committee after the nomination stage submitted an application, which was reviewed in April by the investment committee. Then the final stage was largely talking about the project and the resources that would be available to the teams. The investment committee met in June and recommended the investment portfolio, which was then approved by the board. But I think what was important to note is, given this was our first year of doing this, we really thought that there was going to be a lot of hard decisions at each stage where the investment committee would have to eliminate potential candidates. But really, I think based on the research and the recommendations of the sector team, along with this idea of mutual assessment, that didn't really happen. It seemed like there was organizations that, you know, pulled out of the process because they weren't really ready to take on an SVP team, or SVP didn't have really the right skill set for what they were asking. But throughout the process, it seemed like it really was sort of a mutual work to get to what our final investments were. This slide sort of goes through the number of organizations we were looking for at each stage of the process. I want to point out that initially, when we exclude the organizations that have pass-through funding, SVP had allocated $200,000 in grants, which we initially thought we would fund 8 projects at $25,000. But given the strength of the applicants, we decided to do 10 projects at $20,000. You can see of the 10 funded projects, we have 6 new and 4 reinvestments. And then we have 7 projects without funding, but do have capacity building teams of SVP partners. There's 3 of those with 4 reinvestments. So that's how we get to a total of 17. And here is the portfolio in aggregate. These are the 6 new organizations. Here are the 5 funded organizations. These are 5 reinvestments with funding. And here are the organizations that we have capacity building teams for, but no funding. We also moved some organizations to alumni status. Basically, that means that SVP continues to have relationships with these organizations, but they don't have an active team working on the projects. So I wanted to highlight some of our learnings from this year because it was a pilot year, and also some of our recommendations going forward. We definitely think keeping the expertise with the sector team and the decision-making with the sector teams makes a lot of sense. Those sector teams will only get stronger as they continue an ongoing learning. We think it makes a lot of sense to evaluate the reinvestments and the new opportunities side by side, and be able to kind of reflect on the reinvestments each year to see how that's going before we allocate more money or team resources to them. Mutual assessment is definitely the best practice. It sets us up well to collaborate with these organizations as we move forward. And it is valuable to promote active listening and building trust-based relationships. We also talked about balancing the flexibility and nimbleness of SVP with a more formalized investment review process. We decided it makes sense to have quarterly or as needed meetings as opportunities for investment do come up with outside the kind of March to June cycle. And we want to be able to act on those without waiting. We also clarified when something might need to go through the investment committee. We think any project that requires funding or is going to have, deploy a project team to that organization, that should go through the investment committee. But we know that SVP partners and staff are constantly working with and advising nonprofits, and we, obviously that would continue without approval. This year, we also approved 2 reserve funds, both in the early childhood space and in the emerging opportunity space. The emerging opportunities, that was for their work in Waterbury. And these reserve funds will give those sector teams the opportunity to do small grants or off-cycle grants when they see the opportunities arise. And we also think it probably makes sense going forward to allocate a portion of funds to be used for off-cycle investments. And our last recommendation is, last year, they also piloted a race equity fund, and we think going forward, the race equity investments and should be brought into the whole investment cycle. And I too really just want to thank everybody who helped out on the investment committee this year. Amy Ornstein was a huge asset, being my co-chair, and Sky and Michael and Mark, as well as the rest of the SVP staff, was great. But I really want to shout out to our sector leads, Rob and Jen and Bernie, because they really took on the bulk of the work this year. And we're very flexible as we kind of learned this new process on the fly. So thank you all. And I am now going to turn it over to Michael, who's going to go a little deeper with workforce development.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Lisa. So I've been doing my research, and I want to thank Mark Argosh and Lindy Gold, and one of our alumni, the executive director of one of our alumni partner organizations, Alden Woodcock, for helping me in formulating this presentation. And what it is it is an overview of what is a very complex system. And there are some reasons for that complexity that are quite rational. I have learned a lot. I'll also add the caveat that underneath this is a tremendous amount of detail that is not covered here. Mark could probably fill us in for hours on any particular page on this presentation, but I wanted to make sure that everyone here had sort of a general understanding of who the major players are and what the most significant sectors are. So with that, so the first three sort of general groupings for this presentation. Just a brief explanation as to why we pursue workforce development work, the sectors that make up the ecosystem, and then a run through of the populations that are served. So we our access to and work with all of the players, government, educational institutions, and nonprofits allow us to really pursue systems change in a way that wouldn't be possible if we were only involved in one of, or even two of those sectors. The workforce development, Mark characterized it as more of human development. And I will add that in the 50 years ago, 40 years ago, workforce development was primarily a training and educational pursuit. But now, given the complex human and sociological dynamics that exist, especially with respect to the gap in wealth and opportunity that has grown in our society over the last few decades, it's become much more complex in terms of serving the more vulnerable people in our society. And developing a workforce, equitable and dynamic workforce development system will provide a lot of opportunity and help us create a more equitable society. So our workforce development partners, I think I've got them all here, but we're all very familiar with the Governor's Workforce Council, I think, and the offshoot of that, the Office of Workforce Strategy. And then listed here are some of our workforce development partners. Each one of them has a specific focus on specific populations and specific aspects of the workforce development, and I'll go into that further when we move along. So I broke it down into 3 primary sectors. There are probably other ways to define workforce development, but this is the way I did it for the sake of the rule of 3s, which is always easy to remember 3 things. There's the governmental sector, the education sector, and nonprofits. The government is comprised of really primarily driven by the federal government through the Department of Labor and governed by the Workforce and Opportunity and Investment Act. The state, as I mentioned before, there's the Office of Workforce Strategy, there are workforce investment boards, Department of Labor, Department of Corrections, et cetera, et cetera. And then municipalities have local initiatives. You may be familiar with a local, like summer youth work programs, for instance, are some of the ones that are very common. In education, the community and state colleges, educate people and train them and certify them. There are independent vocational training programs, and there's embedded programming within high schools. And among nonprofits, I sort of divided them into 2 groups. One is where they are those that are focused specifically on workforce development for a specific population, and they case manage those populations. And I'll give you examples in a moment. And then there's embedded program within larger nonprofit organizations that focus on specific populations. So the first category might be an organization like Emerge. A different category would be B1C, which focuses on immigrant populations and all of their needs, including workforce development. There are lots of them. The Office of Workforce Strategy was established, and I already mentioned the U.S. Department of Labor and WIOA, the Workforce Opportunity Act, but they are responsible for overseeing the strategy and alignment of strategy of the workforce investment boards, which then also are responsible for the American Job Centers that are run by separate organizations. The American Job Centers are where if you're unemployed, you walk in and they provide services to allow you to find a job. So in addition to developing statewide policy and strategy with the WIBs, they also are responsible for the allocation of some funding and resources. And when I say some funding and resources, I mean millions of dollars, just not all of the money. The Governor's Workforce Council, and forgive me for those of you who have already read this and it's in the report in its entirety, but I just wanted to make sure I included it here. They're really the first 2 boxes, business leadership and career education building. Those activities were always core to workforce development in the past, over the past 50 or 60 years, at some level or another. What has become more pertinent to these days are the equity and access piece. In other words, there are people with multiple life challenges who struggle to get into the workforce development process, and the Workforce Council developed a number of strategies and initiatives to address that access piece, as well as aligning, for instance, businesses with the vocational training with the WIBs. Basically, in Connecticut, we have lots of institutions that are not particularly well aligned, and that misalignment can be detrimental to people who really struggle in getting through the system. And then the 4th piece was the data and accountability. In other words, measuring outcomes to ensure that the work was getting done in a way that people anticipated. So the education sector, there's no single organization or entity that oversees or provides complete statewide coordination. However, there are lots of different things going on. Among the community colleges, they have credit-based courses that provide associate degrees and other certifications. We had our own with Bernie leading the way with the healthcare technician training program. Independent colleges such as Goodwin College provide advanced manufacturing training or are planning to expand that. And then the high schools, when we were all in school, for most of us, when we were in school, there were high schools that had shop class. Well, now there are high schools that have advanced manufacturing training. And then there's dual enrollment programs where you can gain both high school and college credit while you're in high school. And that way, folks are getting prepared for the workforce while in high school. Among nonprofits, the landscape is highly fragmented, they're independent, and they most often serve very specific populations. So there's an expertise that develops within each of these organizations, and there are hundreds. The two types that I've sort of grouped them in are the standalone, focused exclusively on workforce development. So that may be something like Emerge or OIC, the Opportunities Industrialization Center. And then the others are programming embedded within larger nonprofits. And again, they're also, for instance, there's an organization that works strictly with, provides workforce development and other services for people recovering from drug addiction. They provide it for immigrants, they'll provide it for opportunity youth, they'll provide it for disabled people, and so on. These two types, the nonprofits tend to be characterized by what I would describe as a holistic case management strategy. They tend to work with people who have multiple life challenges, and so they provide or ensure the provision of wraparound services as needed to individuals coming through their organizations. So that could be housing, mental health, transportation, childcare, soft skills, GD prep. And even in the case of Emerge, something like workplace socialization is critical for people coming out of prison. So the organizations and programs that address specific needs and niches. This is a committee and subcommittee framework for a fifth subcommittee of the Governor's Workforce Council that will be called the Equity and the Diversity and the Community Engagement Committee. And what they did is they broke it up into 4 subcommittees: reentry population, veterans, opportunity youth, and persons with disabilities, and then cross-reference that against subpopulations. And for instance, this doesn't include every subpopulation, but because, for instance, there are people who are recovering from a drug addiction, that's not here necessarily. But you could have, there are organizations that work with homeless reentry, people in the homeless reentry space. There are people who, there are organizations that work with undocumented persons who are opportunity youth, and who are Black and Indigenous. So any one of these boxes could be, or more of these boxes could be a focus of a specific nonprofit. So that, in a nutshell, is a broad-based summary. To just review 3 things: there's government, there's the educational sector, and there's the nonprofit sector. Within the nonprofit sector, you have very focused smaller organizations that deal with specific populations, and then you have broader organizations that deal with a wealth of needs of a specific population, and workforce development is one of those needs. The other thing is within the government sector, as you may imagine, it's very, very dense. If you want to start to understand what's pushing things in certain directions there, the best thing to do is to look up WIOA, and under that is an about section. And there's a 1-pager that's beautiful online, Department of Labor, that'll describe like all the reasons for the existence of the act and what they're trying to do. So I'm going to pause there because I wanted to keep this fairly straightforward and leave time for us to interact in our breakout rooms. And you certainly can ask me questions in a breakout room if you have, or if you can't hear, please feel free to contact me, because I will either answer the question or I will find out the answer as part of my continuing education for workforce development. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That is one of the most concise descriptions of the sector that I have ever seen. And those who have been working in this space, we got a thumbs up from Mark. Those who have been working in this space know how hard it was to go through this. And so thank you so much for putting on your hat from your former profession as a math teacher and teaching middle schoolers and helping to bring us all, along together. We are just past 1. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.